We are again, we're going to continue our discussion of the Swift programming language, and we're on the second half of optionals and conditionals. So hopefully you went through the conditional playground here, and now we're going to move on to optionals. Okay, so optionals are a feature that's unique in Swift. Other languages are thinking of adopting this idea, and it's kind of a powerful feature when you understand it. You know, the idea is that sometimes in a program you might have a variable that you've created, but it doesn't get assigned a value. And that means that if your program tries to access that value, it can crash, right? Because you said there's a number here, and then you tell the computer to work with that number, but actually it goes to like an empty address in memory and doesn't know what to do, and the computer crashes. So and this can happen a lot of times, like, you know, you log into the program, but you haven't actually loaded your user profile yet. So if the computer tries to access your username, you know, it doesn't exist yet. It can happen, if you're loading JSON data, and oftentimes JSON data is kind of free form, and we can't guarantee that all the fields are there. So you might load some JSON objects, but some of the fields are missing, right? So some of them are there, some of them are not there. And that's, you know, kind of optionals in a nutshell in some ways, right? Because if something is not there, but it could be there, you know, it's optional that you have it, right? So optionals give us a way of expressing values that might be set or might not be set, okay? And that's their use. So, you know, you can think about the optional as a box, and inside the box you might have a value like the dog, or you might have nil, right? We don't know. So an optional is the box. It's like we create a variable that is a box that might be one of two values inside, right? Oops. And you know, we could open the box and we could find a dog, or we could open the box and find nothing. Okay, so the box itself, even if it contains a dog, it's actually not equal to the dog. Okay, so, or the value. So, you know, we have an optional isn't the same thing as a regular value. Okay, in order to get to the value inside the optional, we must unwrap it, so to speak. Okay, so optionals are a special type, and normally when we create a type in Swift, we saw in the first lesson, the first class, that we define a variable and then we give it a type. So in this case, I've created two variables, volunteer and foster dog, and I've given them a type of string, okay? You know, if we don't have an optional value, then we can just use the variable. So foster dog could just be used, and you know, it would always give me the string lentil, and there would not be a problem, right? Because we set the value, we knew the value's there, the computer can always count on it, okay? If we had a value that might not or if we have a value that may not be assigned, or a variable that may not be assigned a value, what we'll do is we'll type it with the type followed by a question mark, right? And this question mark is the optional. So we've just typed this as optional string. That's how you talk about it in Swift. So this one is also optional string. And that means that the variable foster dog can be a string, or it can be nil. So it could be one or the other. It could be string or it could be nil, okay? Can't be anything else. Can't be a number, can't be a double, can't be an object, right? Can't be a zero, can't be false, right? It's either string, could be any string, right? Or it could be nil. Nil means there's no value there, okay? So let's move on. So if you have a variable that is an optional, before you can use it, you need to unwrap it. So if we were in the Swift environment and we created this variable foster dog and we assigned it the value lentil, and then you tried to print it to the console, what Swift would print is, instead of printing lentil as a string, it would print optional lentil. So it's showing us that this is a special value. It's kind of like a tuple that can either be, you know, nil or some value, right? So anytime you print an optional without unwrapping it, you're going to get this. You're going to get the optional. You're not going to get the value, okay? So in order to get at the value, we need to unwrap the optional, okay? And there's a few ways to unwrap the optional. So one of them is force unwrapping, okay? And you can force unwrap an optional with the exclamation point. So here, if I said foster dog is optional string, and then I said unwrapped dog is foster dog exclamation point, then it would unwrap this, and unwrapped dog would be the name lentil. It would be the string here because we unwrap this with the exclamation point. Now the thing about the exclamation point or force unwrapping is that when you force unwrap something, if it's nil, then your program is going to crash. Okay? So usually we don't want to force unwrap something unless we're sure, like 100% sure that the value is there, okay? So yeah, so here's an example. So what happens if we force unwrap and there's nothing here? So here we have foster dog. It's an optional string, but has never been assigned a value. So if we try to print this one, we would get this error here. And actually you can see I put the exclamation point there to force unwrap it, and it says fatal error unexpectedly found nil, right? While unwrapping an optional value. And this is a common error in Swift, so get used to it. It'll happen to everybody, right? And that's why we're covering this too, to like figure out like how to deal with it, right? So to unwrap a value the safe way, what we're going to do is we're going to use an if statement, and what we're going to do is we're going to say foster dog does not equal nil, and we can say, okay, so if it's not equal to nil, then we can print it with the force unwrapping, okay? Otherwise we can do something else. And that's an okay way, but actually there's a few better ways to unwrap optionals. This is one method, okay? So optional binding. This looks very similar to the last example, okay? But notice there's no variable declaration here, and we're using the does not equal sign. Optional binding says that what we're going to do is we're going to take the value here, assign it to a variable, and if the value is not nil, then we'll do the statement here. Okay, so we're basically taking the value and assigning it to a new variable. So we say let unwrapped dog equal foster dog. So we're using the assignment operator, and if this is nil, if the optional is holding nil, then it assigns nil here in the if statement, sees a nil, and says, okay, let's do the else block. If this is a valid value, then it does the block here. So this is called optional binding. So it's binding because we're going to bind the value to a new variable. Okay? There we go. And then notice we don't have to force unwrap here. We'll just use the value here. So it gets unwrapped in this process. Okay, so here's another one, right? So if we have, hey, let, yeah, and then it says, oh, it's common practice to use a constant variable, right? With the same name as the optional. So you can say foster dog equals foster dog, right? So we can just reuse the same variable. Technically, this variable is scoped outside the if block, and this one gets scoped inside the if block. So there's still two variables. You're not overwriting this one. Okay, so another option is to use the guard statement. That optional binding works for short blocks of code, but if you had a lot of code to run if your variable unwrapped and had a value, then that if block doesn't work. It's a little awkward, right? So what they've given us is this other thing called a guard block. And the guard block works like this. If you say guard let, okay, else, right, this would be the opposite of if there was a value. This is saying like, hey, if foster dog is nil, let's do the block here. Okay, otherwise we'll do the block down here. So you'll notice guard is usually used inside a function. So you put it at the top, and if you see a nil value, you're going to exit your function early with return. So that means if we do the guard block, foster dog was nil, and we just printed this line of code, and then we exited the function before we tried to use the value. And the thing about the foster dog here is it's the variable that you assigned right here. So when you did foster dog let, it assigned the value here, and then you can use that later on in your code, right? Or your function, right? So you can see here if we say buy food for nil, then we're going to say, hey, there's no foster dog right now, so we'll return. And if we have lentil as the foster dog, then we'll say, okay, hey, this is a valid value. We guarded it, so we skip over the guard now, and then we can print the name here. Okay, so what if we want default values for those cases where we get a nil? So in other words, like if you check on something and it says nil, but you want to assign a value and use a default value, right? So let's take a look here. So I've got diet selected is optional string, and then I'm going to do the optional binding. So I'll say, hey, let's let diet equal diet. So if diet is nil, we're going to go to the block down here. Otherwise, we're going to do diet selected. Okay. Let's see here. Wait, did I miss something there? Yeah, I think I got everything there, right? So nil coalescing, right? So this is actually kind of a follow-up to that last one. I think these kind of segue, right? So here, if you have an optional value on this side, you can assign a default value. And this is using the double question mark. So this is nil coalescing, right? So if I say, hey, diet selected is an optional string, then I can say shopping item equals, and if diet selected is nil, then raw food gets assigned to shopping item, right? If I said diet selected and I'd said diet selected is optional string equals, pizza, then pizza would get assigned to shopping item, okay? So the question mark here says asks the question, the double question mark asks, is the item on the left nil? And if it is, assign the item on the right. Otherwise, use the item on the left. Okay, so quick question. How would you declare a double named height with a value of 4.2 that could be set to nil? So in other words, we want an optional double. Okay. Oh, there we go. So height equals nil or does not equal nil. Oh, actually, what is the purpose of this? Sorry, I thought that was the answer, and then I realized that's actually a second question. So question number 2, what is the purpose of the following code? So if height equals nil. Okay, so question number 3, which of the following code snippets uses valid optional binding syntax? Okay, let's see here. So in your own words, what is the purpose of guard? Okay, what will be returned at the end of the function call? So here's our function call, and we've got 3 guard statements in there. Like, what's going to happen here? And then we're going to call it with A of 4, B of 8, and C of nil. Okay, so let's talk about the implicitly unwrapped optional. So sometimes you'll have an optional, but you're like, you know what? I know that I'm going to assign a value to it, and I know it's always going to have a value, but I just need to start with an optional value. And this actually happens in a lot of cases, okay? More often than you would think. So here we've got a string, always has a value, always is a string. Here we have a string, sometimes it's nil, sometimes it's a string. In the last one with the exclamation point, this one says that you have an optional value, but always unwrap it. So anytime you see it, you can use this variable without unwrapping, but it's actually an optional underneath the hood. And the thing about this one means, the thing here, the meaning of this is that if you know that this would always have a value, but by the time you're going to use it, so it could be like you start the program and you don't know what the value for title is, but you know you're going to load it before you do anything else, then maybe this is a good choice. But if title ever got assigned a nil, then your program would crash. Okay, so lab number 2. So this lab covers optional. So you can click on this thing here, go to the optional lab here, and you can click on this thing and download the optional lab as a zip, and open up lab number 2 here and work on the optionals. Okay, so thanks for watching, and we'll continue in the next video.